Hello folks, it's the Pacer Chaser again. Welcome to another one of my videos. In this one we're going to look at the Corgi Toys Majors Motorway Coach from the early 1960s. I recently did a video about dinky toys, and whilst I was buying some dinky toys for that video from a well-known internet auction site, I came across this for sale and the price was right, so I got it. So we're going to look at three main things. First of all, what scale is it? Secondly, what is it? And thirdly, the controversy, shall we say, about whether Corgi should have produced it or not, which is one of those lovely modern sort of internet-based controversies, but we'll come back to that in a bit. So first of all, what scale is it? It's 1/67th scale. If we just stand it next to a 1/76 scale dinky toy, you can see it's much larger. You can see the difference in height there. So the second question, what is it? Or what is it based on, should I say? Now don't worry, I'm going to explain this. If you're not into buses, you don't have to know what I'm talking about just to start with. But it's a BMMO CM5T. Now BMMO were the Birmingham and Midland Motor Omnibus Company. They put the name Midland on the side of the buses because, let's face it, they wouldn't have fitted the full title. And they painted the buses red, so they became known almost instantly to everybody as Midland Red. Now they were very good at marketing and PR before marketing and PR really existed, and they soon got wind of the fact that everybody was calling them Midland Red. So they started to use that title in their publicity with the red in inverted commas to show it was a nickname. They even put it on the front of the bus garages at some points. It said Midland Red Motor Services, again with the red in inverted commas. Later on in the 1960s they actually started to use the name Midland Red on the side of the buses, but that's sort of beyond our scope today. Now in the early days of bus operation, a lot of operators built their own buses and coaches. The reason for that was that some of the early manufacturers were not that good. But as things developed in the 1920s and into the 30s, the more shonky manufacturers, shall we say, fell by the wayside, and manufacturers established themselves who produced reliable products, and it became easier and cheaper to just buy an off-the-shelf vehicle than to build your own. However, BMMO continued to build their own buses and coaches right up to the end of the 1960s. They were quite go-ahead as well. Some of the features, things like underfloor engines, appeared on their products long before they appeared on the ones of the mainstream manufacturers. Now in the early days of building their own, they did various type classifications, model classifications, things like SONs, SOSs, FEDDs. It was just you know, a bit of a mishmash. They soon settled into a more logical system. What I mean by model designations was, if you take like Ford Fiesta as the car, Ford is the manufacturer and Fiesta is the model. So in this case BMMO were the manufacturer, and the models, the single deck buses started in a series of S. So the first model they produced after they started this new system was the S1. The model that replaced it was the S2. Double deckers were D, so D1, D2, and coaches were C1, C2, etc. They were in the C series. So when this type of vehicle first appeared in April 1958, it was a C5, i.e. the fifth model of coach that they'd built. In 1959 the M1 motorway was due to open, or the first section of the M1 motorway anyway, and BMMO, being a progressive company, wanted to be on it with a service, not just any service. They wanted to run non-stop from Birmingham to London. Now at the time in 1958 when the first C5 appeared, the maximum permitted speed on the roads of Britain for buses and coaches was 30 miles per hour. Most of the models that you could buy could go faster than that, but not an awful lot. You know, if you got 50 miles an hour out of one, you were doing quite well. But that was the maximum permitted, 30 miles per hour. Now nobody knew at that point what the speed limit on the motorway was going to be. But in early 1959 the Ministry of Transport confirmed to BMMO that there would be no upward speed limit on the new motorway. Basically you could go as fast as you want. Now for anybody who's into health and safety, please don't have a panic attack. There were very few cars on the road at the end of the 1950s that could go even up to 70 miles per hour, let alone beyond 70, and lorries and buses certainly couldn't. So I think it was thought that there was no need for an upper speed limit because nothing could go that fast anyway. So BMMO set about modifying a C5, one of the ones they were just producing for the second batch. They took it in. The original C5 coach had a 4-speed gearbox. It had a naturally aspirated engine, i.e. not turbocharged. So what they did, they took this vehicle in off the production line and they modified it. They put a 5-speed gearbox in it. They put a high-speed rear axle on it so it could have a higher cruising speed, and they turbocharged the engine. And then they sent it off to the Myra test track near Nuneaton, where it was tested, and they managed to get it consistently to 85 miles per hour. Day after day in testing, it did 85 miles per hour. When they submitted the paperwork to the Ministry of Transport, they hid the light under a bushel a little bit. They put it down the maximum speed as a more modest 76 miles per hour. But they regularly achieved 80 plus in service. Apparently one achieved 90, and there are unconfirmed reports that somebody got one to 100. The CM6T that replaced them later on could do over 100 miles an hour. I think the fastest recorded speed of one of those is 120. Although by that stage they were introduced from about 1965 onwards. In 1965 a maximum speed limit of 70 miles per hour for all vehicles was put onto the motorway. It wasn't so much that had accidents due to speed as such. The problem was the speed differential. I'll show you a photograph. This is one that I bought again on the same well-known internet site. I don't know the original copyright holder. It's actually published in a book I've got with the credit of BMMO, i.e. the company themselves. But it shows you the kind of vehicles that were using the M1 when it first opened. This is in the very early days. You can see over in the Nayside lane there's a very old car. The MOT test wasn't introduced till the early 1960s, so when the motorway opened later on in 1959, there were still quite a lot of very old cars on the roads. If you could get 20 or 30 miles an hour out of them, you're doing quite well. Obviously, there's a more modern car just by look of it passing it there. You could probably get about 50 or 60 out of those, and then coming up behind it, you've got a red bus which could do about 85. And the problem was the speed differential between the older and slower vehicles and the much quicker, newer ones. Basically, drivers would look behind them to do an overtake, see that there was a massive gap until a red bus, and not realise it was going like nearly 3 times their speed. So they'd pull out, and then there'd be a lot of evasive action. So eventually, say 1965, a 70 miles per hour maximum speed limit was put in on the motorway. They were still learning a lot about motorways and things. You can see here the central reservation consists just of a grass verge, as well as the obvious safety implications that you could just cross the grass verge. Another problem they had was snow. My dad was a motorway coach driver in the 1960s, and he said that when the snow settled across the motorway, it was impossible to see which side of the road you were on, because obviously the grass verge disappeared as well. So I mentioned the type code C5, the 5th type of coach that they built. The M referred to the modifications for motorway running. It stood for motorway. So the 5-speed gearbox, the turbocharged engine, and the high-speed rear axle, that made it a CM5, C5 that had been modified for motorway use. The T referred to toilet. Because it was a non-stop service from Birmingham to London, they couldn't pull into the services if any passengers needed the toilet. So they put a toilet on the bus in the rear Nayside corner. You can see here that Corgi have modelled the cubicle. You can see it there through the back windows. Again, this particular bus was selected from the internet because of its cheapness. You can see it's got some broken windows and things, but you can see the toilet cubicle in there. So yeah, it was the 5th type of coach that they produced. It was modified for motorway and it had a toilet, so CM5T. The motorway opened on the 2nd of November 1959, and one of these vehicles did the inaugural non-stop run along it. So that's what it's based on. As we said earlier on, it's 1/67 scale. It's not a scale model, obviously it was built as a toy, but it's quite a good model actually. You can see it's got things like the fuel filler there, there's a grill. The front end's really good. This one's got its transfers missing. It should have a destination blind there, and it should also have some stickers along the roof saying Birmingham London Motorway Express. But yeah, to say it's a toy, it was a very good representation of the real thing. I just found the internet controversy. I've also seen it in print actually, in magazines. People saying, you know, were Corgi right to produce this? Was it the right sort of model to do? Well, it wasn't a model, obviously, it was a toy. They're a bit pointless, these controversies, as we'll call them, because obviously it was 60 years ago. The model, or the toy should I say, was introduced in 1961. It was produced for 2 years. Production ceased in 1963. So short of going back 60 years and getting Corgi to produce something else, there's not much we can do about it. I think the arguments were, they only were supplied to BMMO themselves. Very few of them went into further service with anybody else after they were withdrawn, because they were home built by BMMO, Midland Red, and obviously nobody else had the spare parts for them and things. But you've got to remember, it was a toy. They were aimed fairly and squarely at boys. Now, boys back then would have been subject to various magazines and books extolling the virtues of the modern. When I was a boy in the late 1970s, early 1980s, I had various books and magazines about transport, and it was all about the latest thing. I had a Ladybird book of roads that had a brief history of roads, but most of it was about motorways. Look at this motorway bridge, etc, etc. Motorways were big news when they opened, and not just to children, to adults as well. It became quite common to have a day out just driving up the motorway. You'd go, drive up it, come off at a junction, go round the roundabout and drive back again. That was your day out. Some families would drive along, find a place they liked, pull over and have a picnic on the grass verge. I'm not making this up, it actually did happen. Motorway services as well were a day out in themselves. Obviously they were new. People would drive along to the services, have a cup of coffee and a cake maybe, and then drive home again. That was the day out. So motorways themselves were big news to adults and children. And then as they were driving along the motorway at frequent intervals, these things would go flying past them at unbelievable speeds, this bright red blare. They were quite impressive looking vehicles, not so much perhaps from the side, but certainly from the front, with this sort of lantern windscreen going on. The grille, the Corgi toy represents the bus in its initial form with single headlights. The buses were modified in about the first 18 months of service with twin headlights, which made them look even racier. But yeah, they would have grabbed people's attention. There would have been lots of features of them in the kind of magazines and books that I refer to that were aimed at boys. This new fangled, really fast coach that everybody had seen flying past them, with a toilet on board, so you could go to a toilet on the bus. They would have been really headline grabbing. And if you saw them as well, the livery, I mean, Midland Red's buses were all red. The coaches, as you can see, had this lovely black roof just to set them off. You see old pictures of like London Victoria Coach Station with lots of classic coaches in lovely old liveries, creams and greens and reds. But then you see this bright red bus stood in the middle of them. They really did catch the eye, so it was absolutely the right thing to go for the toy market. They would have captured the imagination of the boys that they were aimed at, and everybody would have wanted one. Obviously things move on, it only had a 2-year production run, did the actual Corgi toy, 1961 and 1963, as I say. By the time 1963 came around, motorways were yesterday's news. The M1 had been extended, other ones had been built, so it wasn't a new modern thing anymore, and it was on to the next thing. So yeah, I think it absolutely was the right thing for Corgi to produce. Not, as I said, it matters anyway, because unless you go back through time, you can't do anything about it. But yeah, absolutely lovely. It was the first bus that Corgi produced. They went on to produce the other ones, most notably probably the Route Master. This was in the Corgi Majors range. It was catalogue number 1120, and when it came out it was priced at 8 shillings and sixpence. They are slightly more than that to buy now, but this one, as I say, was got fairly cheap. If you look around, you can pay as much or as little as you want. If you can find a mint one with a box, you're paying quite a bit. If you find an unboxed one like this, it needs some restoration, considerably less. This one will get some judicious restoration. I'm not going to do a full repaint on it. There's still enough of the original that I can just fettle up what's there. You can buy the transfers on the internet as well, so I'll get a set of transfers for it and just show it some love and attention. I'm not going to do anything about the cracked windows. I've not seen any replacement window units for sale, but I think it just adds to the sort of period charm of it. It is, after all, 60 years old at least. We're doing this video in July 2023. But yeah, absolutely lovely. Might even acquire a few more of them actually, if I can find them at the right price. So anyway, thank you for joining me. As always, take care of yourselves, and I will see you again in any future videos. Bye for now.